Date for the Voice referendum will be revealed this week. It'll happen on Wednesday, and this will kick off the start of a 6-week campaign until Australia will finally have their decision. Well, they'll vote on October 14, it looks like. Joining me live now is the Nationals leader, David Littleproud. It's really hard to see this being any other date now, isn't it, David?
Yeah, look, I think obviously with the Prime Minister going to the United States the week after, it's pretty obvious that he won't want to clash with football finals. Australians won't take kindly to that, so I suspect it's pretty well locked and loaded that the 14th of October is the date that we'll go to the polls on this question.
So what's going to happen here? We know what your position is. It looks to me that the Yes campaign is certainly narrowing its focus. Do you still think that you will prevail here?
Oh, look, taking nothing for granted, and since November last year when the Nationals got to our principal position, that if this was just about constitutional recognition, then we would support it. And sadly, the Prime Minister didn't take that opportunity. He's conflated it with what isn't a new model. It's a model, a representative model that we've had before, and it's failed rural and regional Australians. And so what we're saying is there is a better pathway to constitutional recognition. There is a proper way to do this. And unfortunately, I think regardless of the result, the Prime Minister will lose out of this. He's divided the country instead of bringing us together. He had an opportunity to actually isolate the question and to simply put about constitutional recognition. And I think that most Australians would support that. But this conflation of a representative body, a model we've had before, it's not new, it's not a new proposition, I think has divided our country. And unfortunately, the Prime Minister, regardless of the result, has failed our country in trying to unify it.
You talk about division coming from the push for yes, but what about division, between you and Peter Dutton? You don't necessarily agree on a legislated voice. We don't see Warren Mundine and Jacinta Price necessarily agreeing on the direction. I mean, you all know you're not actually offering solutions, or are you going to get to that?
Well, we do offer solutions. If it was about constitutional recognition and a proper constitutional convention where all Australians got to say on what the question and the intent of the question being put to the Australian people was proposed, rather than just 250 Indigenous Australians getting to have that say. If there was a question about how do we close the gap, we actually do agree with that.
And that's the question,
this is about a 2023...
Closing the gap. Actually, nothing has worked so far. No. Nothing.
There are two... But doing the same thing as what we've done in the past won't work. But there is a better way to do this, Laura. No, it's not. This is where people in metropolitan Australia need to understand we are repeating the mistakes of the past. This is not a new proposition. This is a representative body. And what this means for us in rural and remote areas, it's hard for people in capital cities to get their heads around this. But you are going to have a representative that is covering hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of square kilometres, hundreds of different diverse communities. And what we are doing is falling into the trap of sending them back to Canberra and letting the bureaucracy to generalise and then to nationalise programs that are not fit for purpose in individual communities. Rather than getting the bureaucracy out of Canberra, we need a better bureaucracy, not a bigger one, taking the bureaucracy out of Canberra and sitting there and empowering local elders, because we know to the postcode where the challenges are and what the challenges are in closing the gap. And so that has been the tenet of what we've said, and we should have a forensic audit of the $4 billion that is being spent. There's a generosity of spirit and a generosity of financial support to close the gap. It's just that repeating the mistake of what we've done in the past, it will be us in rural and remote Australia that will miss it out again, rather than doing something different. And the voice isn't something different, but what we could have done in unifying this country is asking us, do we believe Indigenous Australians were here first? We've made serious mistakes, but we are better having been together, and we will be better sticking together. I think that would have been a unifying moment. The Prime Minister let it go, and in fact, he's simply just divided the country.
What happens when this voice let's say it is defeated? Let's say the Australian people say no on October 14. Is that the end of it?
No, there'll be no victory lap from the Nationals. Let me make that very clear. I'm very proud of the respectful tone in which we've handled this debate. The very first words that'll be uttered out of my mouth is that if the Prime Minister wanted to commit and recommit to constitutional recognition and undertake due process, there's no need to defer that any longer, to have a constitutional recognition, to get the question to the Australian people right, to give them that opportunity to unify this nation about constitutional recognition. We will be a constructive force in that. That's my responsibility as a political leader to be able to say that. With respect to closing the gap, what we'd be saying to this government is let's undertake that forensic audit. Let's actually empower local elders. Let's have a 2023 intervention, an intervention in Canberra with the bureaucracy and putting them out with these local elders. And if you go and spend time with these local elders, they can invariably solve the problems that we have in closing the gap in their local communities. But it's bespoke and it's local to that particular community. That is the leadership that Nationals are signing up to, but there'll be no victory lap. We want to be constructive in this. We've been constructive all the way.
Yeah, you say bespoke, and you're right. It's the local communities that know what the solutions are for their own people. I'm thinking of, leaders in the Kimberley and Arakoon. They are for this voice.
Not all of them, Laura. I don't think you want to generalise like that.
No,
and I think if you travel,
one homogenous group.
If you want to travel, let me tell you where you do get to close the gap. And you listen to these people. What they fear is that when we had ATSIC last time, and forget about who controlled the chequebook and how the money was spent. It was just that it was generalised and then nationalised in terms of the challenges and opportunities that were there. And many of these people felt they missed out because their challenge and their solution is different to that of a community a couple of 100 kilometres down the road. I mean, I get in capital cities, you're a couple of kilometres down the road, but you are talking about different communities that have different challenges. But if you empower them, then they have buy into their local program, and you see that. And that's where it has worked in us closing the gap in areas where we have empowered those local elders. They're the ones that need to be empowered, not on a big regional level, because that's when their voice becomes diluted. That's the mistake that we'd be making, that we did with ATSIC, is just having someone. And you look at Queensland, 3 representatives. One of those is probably going to be running over regional Australia. I represent 10% of the Australian landmass. Let me tell you, just in my own electorate. And a challenge and opportunity in Warwick is different to that in Winton or in Cunnamulla. And they're 1,200 kilometres away. And this is where, if you sit down with these elders, that's the solution. That's doing something different. Not repeating the mistakes of the past of sending someone to Canberra where bureaucrats just let them fall into the same trap of generalising all their data and then putting out a national program because it's easy for them.
Yeah, that's not what the Yes campaigners say would happen, though. This would be different. And look, we'll get into the nuance. We do this once a week, you and I. So we're running. And
the Prime Minister could solve that.
Yeah. Sure. I just quickly want to ask you.
The Prime Minister could solve that. He could put the legislation in the Parliament. He could put the legislation in the Parliament so that not politicians could disagree or agree, but the Australian people could see. But he won't even trust them to put that legislation in the mechanics.
Parliament will always get the final word.
But this is a change in the Constitution. The Australian people should have a say on what the change is and what the mechanics of the voice would be.
They do.
No, they don't. You don't know what the details are. Sorry, Laura, you don't. The mechanics have not been described as to who will represent, how they'll be elected, what areas they'll represent.
Parliament of the day to decide, is it not?
That the Australian people should determine that. This is their constitution. The Australian Parliament shouldn't be messing around with that. You should know the mechanics of this before you walk into that ballot box.
The Australian people get to decide on the makeup of their own parliament, and then the parliament in which the Australian people elect then work out the mechanics. Is that not the way this would work?
No, the Parliament will determine the mechanics of what the reach of this will be, of who it will consult, how it will consult, and that's not how the change to your constitution will be, because that's enshrined for perpetuity rather than actually the Australian people getting determined of how far-reaching this representative body will be and what impacts it will have in the advice that it provides, not just to the government, but to the Parliament, but to the executive government. And that opens up as constitutional lawyers from both sides who agree, eminently qualified. The only way to arbitrate that is through the courts. That's not a change to our constitution that I think is a healthy one that unites our country. But Australians should know that before they walk into the ballot box, exactly how much advice this representative body can give, how far-reaching it is. That is what Australian government who put in this proposition, Anthony Albanese, has the power to do. He runs the parliament. If he says there's nothing to fear, table it and let the Australian people determine that. I might be wrong. I'm prepared to be wrong.
No, that's right. But what we are seeing, what the Australian people will be asked to vote on, it doesn't matter. A parliament of the day still has the final say. Do you accept that?
No, this is where you've got to be very careful, depending on what the reach of this will be. And this is the reach in terms of the advice it can give to the executive and to the parliament. It's not just the parliament.
You've got to be careful. Isn't it the parliament of the day that has the final say? That's black and white.
Well, as eminent lawyers have from both sides have agree and disagree on this, is that it would have the reaching powers that it may have on the advice that it gives, and if the government doesn't accept that advice, whether it has then the power to challenge that and to challenge the fact that the executive government has ignored the advice of this representative body. That is far-reaching. That actually would slow down closing the gap in implementing policies and actually give one portion of our population far greater reach into the running of our government than any others. That's not the Australia that I'm part of. I think we've got 227 voices in that parliament that represents every Australian, no matter your race, no matter your religion. And if there's disadvantage, we've got a proud record of going in through the generosity of our spirit, but also our financial support to fix that. And I think we just need to do that part of it better.